My name is Megan Tuttle. I'm the director of the Office of City Planning. I was previously our comprehensive planner for about 6 years and moved into this role about a year ago when David White retired. So nice to meet those of you who are new.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Charles Dillard. I am principal planner in the Office of City Planning. Moved to Burlington from North Carolina. Physically arrived in August. I've been working for almost a year since March, and it's good to see everybody.
I spent many years on the design advisory board, and currently I'm acting as an alternate on the development review board. You know, it's
Major LaRosa, the chair of the DRB.
I'm Chase Taylor. I'm on the DRB.
Miles Waite on the Conservation Board.
I'm Zoe Richards, and I'm chair of the Conservation Board.
My name is Lena Swislocki, and I'm also on the Conservation Board.
Hi, I'm Julia Randall. I'm on the Planning Commission.
I'm Andy Montrol. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission.
Jeff Hand, I'm on the DRB.
Leo Sprinzen, I'm also on the DRB.
Emily Morse, I'm on the DAB.
Kathleen Ryan, I'm a substitute on DAB.
Gabriel Statiker, I'm on the DAB.
And hoping we can go online for those of you that are joining us remotely. We'll go Carolyn, Don, and then Emily.
My name is Karen Connolly, and I'm on the Conservation Board.
Don Meals on the Conservation Board also.
Hi everyone, my name is Emily. I'm an alternate on the DRB, and this is actually my first meeting with you all, so nice to be here. Thanks.
Great. So then do we want to go? Sorry, I missed the back row. If you want to go.
Joseph Papa for the DRB.
I'm Sarah Morgan. I'm here with Megan Charles from City Planning.
And I'm Scott Gustin.
Mary O'Neill. I'm
All right, great. Thank you all. As Scott said, thanks everyone for being here tonight. Charles is going to pull up some slides and we'll get started on our presentations. The first policy issue that we wanted to share an update with you on is actually one that is brand new, something that council took action on just last Monday night, but really is something that I think most of you will find familiar, and that is a change to our parking standards here in Burlington. So for a quick background, for those of you who were not on the boards 2 years ago, in 2020, the City Council adopted a zoning ordinance change that removed the minimum on-site parking requirements in essentially our downtown and in other kind of high-density mixed-use areas of Burlington, or zoned for high-dense mixed-use development in Burlington. And with that, first implemented TDM, Transportation Demand Management Standards, as part of our zoning requirements here in Burlington. So I would imagine those of you that are on the DRB have gained some familiarity with these new policies over the last couple of years. I know working with Scott and hearing updates about the number of projects that have come through that have been required to have TDM plans and to really kind of move into this new framework of regulating parking by maximums rather than minimums. Really quick update for you on how that's been going. About a year ago at this time, we worked with Scott to go through some of the larger projects that you all had seen come through the permitting process here in Burlington to just understand what the effect of that change really meant for housing developments in particular in our downtown. So these are 6 projects that had received permits or amended permits since that zoning change was adopted in late 2020. And really focusing on the bottom half of this graph at the projects that are in the light blue. These are 3 new residential projects in downtown Burlington, all that are fewer than 50 units. And you can really see that the effect of switching from minimums to maximums has had the greatest impact for these projects. We've seen these projects come in anywhere from 25 to 70% fewer parking spaces than what the ordinance would have previously required them to achieve. But again, as part of that, required to provide new transportation demand management benefits to the occupants of those buildings. The projects that you see on the top half of the screen have had less of an effect, we would say, in terms of the policy change, in part due to their location in the city. 2 of the 3 on the top half of the screen are further from downtown. They're senior housing project out on Riverside Avenue and the Cambrian Rise project. And one of them was already subject to parking agreements as part of its permit process. So really, we've been looking at these newer, smaller projects in the downtown to kind of measure what the impact has been of this policy change. And we've just had a couple years of implementation of that piece of the policy when in late 2021, the City Council introduced an extension of this policy, really to take that translation of minimum parking requirements to maximum parking limits and TDM requirements citywide, essentially. So that is the policy, in short, that was just adopted by the City Council on Monday night and will be going into effect here shortly. While it was the original intent of the councilor that introduced this policy to essentially keep everything else about this policy the same, as you can imagine, over the year plus of discussion about changing this part of our zoning ordinance, there were a number of other parts of the ordinance that ended up being modified as well. So I'll just quickly run through the sort of 3 major things that this amendment does. The first, as I've said a couple of times, just switches from a reliance on minimum on-site parking requirements to maximum on-site parking limits. By and large, the amendment, while it introduces a new table of parking maximums, it really maintains our previous maximum parking standards in large part. There were a couple of places that we used this policy as an opportunity to address some challenges we knew we were already having with how the ordinance was structured before. For example, where the maximum parking limit was 0 in our multimodal mixed-use district, people would have to actually come to you as the DRB to ask to have 1 space per dwelling unit or 1 space per 1,000 square feet of commercial space. This fixed that problem and ensured that the maximum limit for those uses is 1 space per whatever the increment is. There are a couple new minor exceptions to our maximum limits, such as for ADA accessible parking spaces, residential driveways, and an important caveat in terms of how this change dovetails with the institutional parking management plans, which I'll talk about in a second. And then, again, in large part, this maintains our 3 different parking districts, the neighborhood, shared use, and multimodal mixed-use parking districts. The only district's boundary that changed is the multimodal mixed-use district. As part of a rezoning for the BHS site on Institute Road, the council changed the parking district for that property from neighborhood to multimodal mixed-use. But otherwise, the boundaries for those districts remain the same. The next set of amendments that we made to this part of the ordinance was related to the TDM standards that were newly adopted in 2020. So again, this expands the requirement to provide a TDM plan for developments of 10 units or greater or 15,000 square feet of gross floor area to all parking districts where it previously only applied in the multimodal district. And now creates a few new tiers for TDM requirements. One specific thing that the council heard a lot of feedback about was the fact that our TDM standards did not provide enough flexibility to allow for individual developments to tailor their TDM strategies to the users or to their location. So one of the new tiers that was introduced in this amendment was that for projects over these size thresholds that include 75% or more inclusionary housing units, those projects are only required to provide education and outreach and do some of their agreement that they don't have access to off-street parking, etc. They also introduced a new tier for smaller residential projects. So these are developments between 5 and 9 units. These projects are simply required to unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of rent or the sale of the unit. And then the last piece that was modified in terms of the TDM strategies themselves is that, again, instead of all of the TDM strategies being fixed strategies that apply to every development, this amendment gives a modest bit of flexibility in terms of developments being able to select 2 out of a list of 5 potential TDM strategies to utilize for their project. Go ahead, AJ.
So, Megan, looking at the second.
Mm-hmm.
If someone does a 9-unit development and can provide quote unquote parking, they can meet, they can have a transportation demand management strategy, right? And one of those issues is that they have to unbundle the cost of parking from rent or sale. My question is, how would we, as the DRB, have any ability to consider that or deal with that or process, like, what's the rent or what's the sale?
It's a great question. So, and I believe in a lot of cases, this issue would not come to the DRB. This is not an in lieu of standard. This is something that would be required for all developments of 5 to 9 units to comply with. So there's no longer a requirement that they provide any number of spaces. They are capped at, if it was 9 units, they'd be capped at 18 parking spaces if it's in the neighborhood district, for example. And they would be required to then unbundle the cost of parking from the cost of rent or the sale price of a unit. And I don't know if you want to speak to how you've seen that demonstrated in other TDM plans.
It's really been forwarded as a condition of approval, either explicit or as part of the TDM package. I think it's still accurate to say we haven't seen one of these TDM projects that actually occupy that. That's still
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be condition of approval. If it became an issue, then we'd want to see, okay, so what is your, say, for example, how that's structured.
I know we have heard anecdotally from people living at Cambrian Rise, for example, that they have actually been offered a different rental rate if they don't have a car versus if they do have a car on site. So we do know that some projects have begun to implement this, even if, like Cambrian Rise, for example, really was permitted before these standards were in place. But that's essentially how this is intended to work. I will say, and I'll get to this at the very end, that your question, though, is one of the, I would say, ongoing pieces of this work is just about how we actually implement this and what is the best location for some of these standards. So I'll talk about that in just a second. The last piece of the ordinance that was amended, in part out of necessity, was the section that talks about the institutional parking management plans. For those of you that aren't familiar, the parking management plans are required by each of the 3 Hill institutions as a way to analyze their demand for parking and how they're meeting it, as well as how they're reducing that demand. In the past, these parking management plans essentially amounted to a parking waiver. They would provide justification for why the number of parking spaces that our ordinance would have otherwise required was not necessary to meet their demand and would bring a comprehensive plan before the DRB for approval. Because we no longer require a minimum number of spaces, it required us to rethink how that works. So now the institutional parking management plans continue to be required for all 3 of the Hill institutions. And instead of being used essentially as a waiver process, we have strengthened some of the language around what specific types of generators of parking demand we need them to look at and what types of strategies they are providing information on how they are utilizing in order to meet or reduce that demand. The process also requires an annual report and update to the city. And reapproval of this plan, preparation and reapproval of this plan at least every 5 years, if not more frequently, based on the DRB's approval. So as we were working through kind of the mechanics of how to update this section of the ordinance, we were also asked to consider how to give a little bit more teeth to this section of the ordinance in terms of enforcing the implementation of the plan. So there are two new pieces of this, and I think the DRB actually saw one of the new pieces of this recently. We actually require that the plan be approved as a prerequisite to issuing a zoning permit for development on the institution's campuses, as well as a prerequisite to getting a certificate of occupancy. And the other piece that we strengthened was clarifying that failure to submit the annual report on performance of the plan is a zoning violation. So it really requires the institutions to more closely engage in this process. We also implemented a new 6-month extension process for the DRB to actually, if the institutions are working on updating their plan, they can come and request a one-time extension in order to ensure that that plan remains in effect. And then as far as next steps, when the original policy was adopted in 2020, the City Council budgeted for us, our office, in collaboration with DPW, to actually conduct a transportation demand management study to help us better evaluate the best ways for us to be affecting TDM in the city. This amendment got introduced before we could actually do that work, but it still very much is on our work plan. And we recently completed interviews for a consultant that's going to help us evaluate the effectiveness of previous TDM plans and policies, best practices for how to move this work forward, and then recommendations for better or other regulatory approaches that we could take to implementing TDM. So this will be something that we'll be continuing to work on over the coming year. So with that, I'll stop talking about parking, although I know we could probably talk about parking all night. Any other questions?
We're presenting these parking things, we have TDM and sales rules. You never get any feedback as to how these things work. Or if that's something that's being looked at now and you get feedback at some point about.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great idea for something that we could share in one of these meetings in a future year. I know Scott has been hearing a lot of that feedback. Scott's been involved in helping work with all of the major transportation agencies in the area to provide better guidance for applicants on exactly what qualifies to meet our requirements. But we have not yet received anyone's annual report to demonstrate what the reduction in demand might have been or participation in the programs might have been because these requirements are so new. But that is part of what we anticipate that our consultant will help us look at. Is just, how effective in the first few years of implementation have our existing policies been, or what other tools could we use to be more effective? Right. Does it shift the mode share? Yep.
Some other other property that's not being looked at.
Oh, I see. Yep.
That's what happened at one site. It may affect other sites in our.
Right. Yep. Off-site parking. Yeah. Yep.
Could a project that already has a permit under the old system, it has yet to be developed, could they go back and retroactively amend their permit with the new maximums?
Yeah, I think it depends the extent to which they are amending their permit overall. In the 2020 ordinance amendments, we did allow for projects that are in the downtown multimodal mixed-use district to actually come back and amend their permit to get rid of previous parking requirements. And that was really an effort to try to make or open up more sharing of parking, particularly in the downtown where there may have been off-site resources that were precluded from being shared in the past. But we do allow that in some places.
Who's developed the TDM, the requirements and the metrics around that?
Where did these come from?
Yeah.
Yep. The TDM standards that we have in our ordinance right now date back to our process of changing the zoning in 2019-2020, and really emerged from a discussion with members of the public and members primarily of all the major transportation organizations about what standards we thought could fit into our ordinance today. I think we've always recognized that this is just our first dipping of our toes into the water of regulating TDM, and we know it's not perfect, but that's essentially how it emerged.
If you get a zoning violation by not doing your yearly report, or how is that going to be handled? Is that going to land back in front of one of these boards, or is it handled administratively? How is zoning violation? So,
Do you want to talk to that one, Scott?
I think, well, there's an annual reporting requirement as part of this. And those annual reports go to us to point into our.
Sorry, for everyone, if you're wondering about the mics, it's so that everyone remotely can hear us. It's so. You just want to pick the whole thing up?
I'll just lift the thingamabob. All right. So it has an annual reporting requirement to us. If for some reason we don't get that annual report, we would follow up with the applicant or the owner at the time and say, hey, we haven't seen this. What's up? Can you submit it within, 30 days? And we haven't done this yet. Hopefully that happens. If it doesn't happen, then it follows up with a notice of zoning violation, and that's appealable, and that goes to this board. I would like to think that based on how violation work typically works, friendly outreach to say, hey, there's an issue here, especially for something as basic as submitting a report, would take care of it. But the way the ordinance is worded, it would become a violation enforcement matter if folks didn't submit what they needed to eventually.
Megan, is the annual reporting requirement for anyone in the TDM plan, or is it just the institution?
Neither. It's well, it's not just the institutions, and we have TDM Light now, right? So if you're TDM Light, you don't have an annual reporting requirement. You're giving me a bad look. I didn't think there was a reporting requirement.
No, there is a reporting requirement.
For even the little ones, the TDM Lights?
For the projects of 10 units or greater, there is an annual reporting requirement for 7 years following the implementation of the plan. There are also some requirements that the project manager do some surveys of the tenants or occupants of a building in order to understand their utilization of some of the benefits that are being provided. And that information is to be provided to the administrative officer upon request. But the specific issue of the zoning violation, I believe that is for the institutional plans, although it might be for both now that I'm thinking about it. Doing it again.
So project gets approved with TDM. They need to provide their annual reports. They decide midway through, screw you guys, we're not doing this anymore. Our friendly outreach doesn't produce results. Then it does become an enforcement issue with zoning violation.
And just one more follow-up. Is the idea for the institutional plans that they would also provide the DRB all of those annual reports when they come in for renewal? And one of the things we struggle with even there, they have to be renewed at least every 5 years, but we don't often have a good way to judge their effectiveness.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know the Planning Commission also sees the institutional plans before they come to the DRB for approval, and that's actually been a topic of discussion for them as well. So it's not explicit in the ordinance, but we have tried to improve that process of annual reporting. So, for example, the Planning Commission saw an update on their first annual report ever just this past year. So that's something that we can talk with Scott about as well, making sure that the DRB gets those updates as well.
It seems like it would be the applicant's benefit to give us those 4 or 5 years, whatever it is, in advance or as part of the application. Otherwise, I think we're just gonna ask for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know how things went. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, we could talk about how to provide those to you as well when they come to us.
And I guess I should clarify. I think it's only necessary to give them to us when we have an action to take. It would be as part of the 5-year.
The next update.
Next step.
Okay. Great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'll move us on past parking then. I seem to be having some technical difficulties. So the next set of policies that we want to share an update with you on emerged from the 10-point housing action plan that was announced back in December of 2021. This plan supports two major goals related to housing in the city. The first goal being to double the rate of housing production over the next 5 years from the previous 5 years rate. And the second goal was to end chronic homelessness in Burlington by 2025. So we're going to share an update with you on just 3 of the 10 points in this action plan that relate to zoning amendments that you are going to see coming forward in the next year. Number 8 in the 10-point plan was to explore new housing opportunities through the creation of a mixed-use district in a portion of the South End. And I'm actually going to turn this over to Charles to walk us through this portion. Are we missing slides?
No, we're not missing slides. They're just what we're going to do is first we're going to go to the South End Innovation District. We'll come back to these slides on Trinity campus and missing middle housing, and then we'll go back. We're a bit out of order here. So the South End Innovation District, and there are a lot of slides here. I will be as quick as I can. This is an idea that came out of the Plan BTV South End planning process that was adopted in 2019. That plan called for the creation of a district in a portion of the Enterprise Light Manufacturing District where arts and the burgeoning office market that exists in the South End could be fostered and continue to grow. Notably, the plan and the community input behind the plan stated that residential uses should not be contemplated presently in any future innovation district, but that conversations in the community should continue over the coming years. And those conversations have continued and accelerated, I think, with everybody's acknowledgement of a housing shortage and crisis in Burlington and elsewhere. The idea and notion of housing in the South End Innovation District has become popular. And I think that in our community outreach and in our discussions with the Planning Commission and very sort of nascent discussions with the council, I think there's, I wouldn't say unanimous, but clear support for housing in the Innovation District. And so this district is intended to both foster economic growth through arts and innovation in the South End, while also being a place where a significant portion of the city's growth can occur. And you can see that it would primarily take place on what is now vacant, underutilized property, including some very large, fully impervious parking lots. And the boundary of the proposed district is here in orange. So essentially from Howard Street in the north to just below Sears Lane in the south, and from the lake right along Hula's property to Pine Street. Bit of a sort of broken tooth smile here on Pine Street, but we didn't want to include all of the properties on Pine Street for reasons we can get into if folks would like to have that discussion. And so the intent of the Innovation District, again, is to create a really vibrant urban district. I think, you know, both in Plan BTV South End and in our community outreach, people are really hoping to see something that is very walkable, that is car light, that is a place where it's comfortable and safe to live, but also where people who are in residence can coexist with arts, light manufacturing, and office uses. Notably, I would say that this bottom point about, limiting emissions, cleaning our water, and fostering a healthy ecosystem, I think this is not really an afterthought. This has been sort of front of mind throughout our process in creating this zoning amendment. So would be thrilled to hear how you all, Conservation Board particularly, feel about some of the proposals. So again, the Innovation District, as we're conceiving it, is sort of a combination of that first generation of Plan B TV South End with the more recent Housing as a Human Right Action Plan that Megan just mentioned. So I'm going to really briefly talk about the land use component and an urban form component for the zoning amendment. We're sort of calling this a form code light. It is not as prescriptive as the downtown form code is, but it is more prescriptive than the sort of base ordinance. So the land use concept sort of divides, it creates two tiers of permitted uses, permitted primary and secondary. The permitted uses are those uses that include sort of multifamily residential uses and things like arts, office spaces, and some community spaces that were sort of examples of community spaces could be childcare, library, schools, that sort of thing. So those uses really speak to the intent of the Innovation District as envisioned in Plan BTV South End. And then there's this secondary permitted use category, and those can only be provided on a site at a 1 to 2 basis as proposed today with those non-residential uses in the primary category. So for example, if a developer comes in and they know they want to develop a 5,000 square foot restaurant in their development, they would have to provide at least half of that, 2,500 square feet, of any of those uses in the primary category. So if we see somebody come in with a 10,000 square foot childcare facility, they'd be able to then develop 20,000 square feet of any combination of those uses in the secondary category. And again, this is really meant to sort of balance the need between protecting and preserving and fostering arts and innovation while making room for a vibrant, convenient urban district. There's a list of non-permitted uses, but really those are those uses, some of which are permitted today that simply are not conducive to and compatible with an urban residential neighborhood, heavy manufacturing, logistics, single family homes.
Are there single family homes in that district?
There are no homes in the district, and no single family homes are allowed either. Today, in the district, what is mostly allowed is manufacturing, some commercial uses, buildings up to 4 stories, and 80% lot coverage and a few other standards. The urban form concept regulates a host of things. I won't go through them all right now, but we've had some really productive conversations over the last 6 to 8 months with members of the public and the Planning Commission that we think have narrowed in on a key set of urban form strategies. So building bulk. So we talk about floor area ratio and maximum building footprint. So we're proposing a maximum building footprint of 15,000 square feet. The Miller Center on Lakeside Avenue across the street is actually just under 15,000 square feet for reference. Any floors 7 and 8 would be limited to 10,000 square feet unless those buildings are constructed to passive house standards or other rigorous sustainable building techniques. The floor area ratio is proposed at 2.25, increased at 2.5 with the inclusionary zoning bonus of 0.025 or 0.25. This seems low to some people, but given the size of some of these properties, the building heights allowed, we have shown through modeling the site in various permutations that we can fit hundreds of homes in this district, potentially even more than hundreds, but conservatively very easy to reach 400 or 500 homes on just half of the district itself. So these are just some examples. These are not endorsements of any or depictions of any development scenarios, but just to sort of show you what a 2.25 FAR might look like. So this is the 125 Lakeside property just across the street. So at an FAR of 2.25, including 570 parking spaces, which is more than one per unit. You could get 483 residential units and a significant amount of non-residential space. Similarly, a property on Pine Street that's just, I think, just a few acres could easily fit at an FAR below 300 residential units and a good amount of retail space.
Is that the Barge Canal area?
Barge Canal would be just west of here. That's right.
Of that site, just west of?
This site is actually the site that is proposed for the bathhouse and the bowling alley.
Okay, so it's the north side of the Barge Canal.
East
It's
side.
453 Pine
Yep.
Street is the specific property that was just modeled as an illustrative example.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
It's across from Dealer.com.
Yes.
That's right.
Yep.
That's concept only.
Yes.
You cannot do that at 453.
Yeah.
You-
This is literally just
Just-
what the FAR means. Yeah.
Maybe should have
Yeah.
put this text in bold. Yes. No, this is really just to show what that kind of FAR looks like. 'Cause I think for a lot of people, not experts like you find FAR to be kind of difficult to understand. So building height, we are permitting buildings up to 8 stories in limited locations though. So, and this is as it stands today. So any areas depicted in red on this map would permit up to 8 stories, yellow up to 6, and blue up to 4. So you can see that we're trying to consolidate sort of the tallest buildings in the core of the district to remove height off of Pine Street to keep it sort of consistent with the built character today. We've had a lot of discussions about building height over the last month or two, so I'm expecting maybe some questions here, but we have diagrams on our website and in some other presentations that we can share that sort of show what the impact might be. Just for your information, the ordinance today actually states that the city's policy is to the extent practicable, preserve views of the lake and the Adirondacks from public open space only, and that it's very explicit, the ordinance is, that private views from private property are not to be, protected from taller buildings. Champlain Parkway. Yes.
Not have any of the like setback right above the lake shore there. You just don't have that.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Pervious area. So the base standard is 20%, so 80% lot coverage, with a minimum 25% composed of GSI, green stormwater infrastructure, or that pervious amount can be reduced to 10% if all of that pervious area is composed exclusively of green stormwater infrastructure that is approved by Department of Public Works. Setbacks, minimum 0, maximum 20. Initially, we had this at 10, but we actually had some stakeholders say, we've heard from tenants of newer buildings that would like more outdoor seating space. So we think 20 is appropriate. It still maintains an urban character while allowing more flexibility. On frontage, so this is the amount of a lot's frontage onto a public street or path that must be occupied by buildings. So we have primary and secondary frontages in the district. Primary is at 80%, secondary is at 70%. So, this is just an illustrative example of how that might work. The block face on the left is the primary street with an 80% coverage, and the one on the right, 70% lot coverage as occupied by buildings. Ground floor uses. We're trying to promote active ground floor uses with the caveat that nationally, maybe internationally, there is an abundance of vacant retail space in new development, new mixed-use development particularly. I come from a place, Raleigh, that has seen a ton of development and unfortunate amount of vacant retail space on the ground floor, and I think this is true in many cities, and so we wanted to sort of think about that in developing these standards. So these amounts can be reduced if developers will agree to take some different approaches to site design or the program of their development. So on the primary frontages, that can go down to 30% active use requirement, or no requirement on the secondary frontages. One way that they can achieve that is by providing affordable non-residential uses. Another way is to provide an equivalent amount of non-residential space in detached structures. So think about the Lunig's kiosk. This is on the bottom right. This is I think a development from Poland, I believe. A collection of shipping containers that have been turned into a sort of outdoor market. So again, if a building, wants to exempt themselves from 500 square feet on the ground floor of a building, they could construct something equivalent out in the public realm, in a plaza on the streetscape that would meet the standard. Providing active, publicly accessible open space, at least 4,000 square feet in size, located adjacent to that building, would allow for that reduction in ground floor use requirements. And the last way that they can achieve this is by providing family-sized units. This is a problem nationally as well, where many new apartment buildings have only studios and 1 bedrooms, maybe a sprinkling of 2 bedrooms. But it's a real problem here, and many cities are trying to create family-sized units in new developments. We know there's building code issues that I think are at the foundation of that problem, but we want to try and stem that tide a little bit. Just a few others. We want to be very flexible with the depth requirements and allow some very shallow spaces, acknowledging again that these could be expensive and that these shallower spaces might be ideal for people like artists who could be living and working in the district. Want active uses at building corners, and we want to make sure that buildings have ground floor entries at a reasonable spacing. Block perimeter, this is something that we've had I would say a pretty good deal of conversation about. So we're proposing a maximum block perimeter of 1,600 feet, allowing developers and property owners to create block patterns of their own. But the only requirement is that they can be no more than 1,600 feet in perimeter, and they can be achieved through any combination of public streets and paths. So you might conceivably see blocks created in the district on some of these large blocks, like across the street, where there's only a block might have 1 street on one side and all the other sides of the block are multi-use paths, that sort of thing. This is just to show you sort of dimensionally how 1,600 feet lays out on the ground in the district. Parking, really want to minimize parking, but do acknowledge that some people do rely on cars to get around. So permitting a limited amount of surface lots and making sure that any parking garages are designed in a way that sort of mitigates the negative impacts of parking structures. That's it on the Innovation District. We have an extensive website that Sarah built for us. If you have not seen it yet, you should check it out. You could probably answer many of the questions you have right now just on that website, but happy to take them now.
Can I try one that you might
Sure.
not have talked about? This would adding, hundreds of people and cars or no cars, but has there been any traffic studies that would predict the impact on not only Pine Street, but the new Champlain Parkway?
Yeah, I know that traffic studies have been done related directly to the parkway, and that there are concerns, frankly, about some of the intersections, Lakeside Avenue and the future Parkway being one. I can't speak for exactly what that data says. The CCRPC, the Regional Planning Commission, did just complete a study looking at the feasibility of constructing a potential transit station and very large parking structure in the area.
That was a while ago, right?
They just completed a couple months ago.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I know there's some data in that report, but I don't know off the top of my head what it says.
Well, that's my first, observation that Pine Street right now has periods of time where it's really, backed up. And will that be relieved by the Champlain Parkway or not? I mean, it doesn't go direct. It'll have its built-in own clog points, I think. everybody agrees.
So one thing I'll just add to what Charles said about studies that have been done so far is that as part of moving forward with this zoning framework, we are also continuing to do some further planning work especially in the vicinity of this area around Lakeside Avenue. So we'll be able to explore in greater detail what potential development projects that could come forward as a result of this zoning framework may result in terms of transportation, other public infrastructure considerations. So that's something we're continuing to do as well.
So do applicants right now require a transportation study to back up their increase in use of?
Yeah, under our current ordinance, I think the majority of the projects that you would see in this area would probably fall under a major impact or maybe even a conditional use project that would require those studies to be provided.
See, Mary's nodding her neck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So larger project like that, still, the way you framed it was permitted something else. Permitted is a term.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are not strictly provable as permitted, issuing, changing the terminology. Or what would come before the DRB?
Yeah. It's a great question. So the uses themselves, we are proposing many of them to be permitted allowable uses, not conditionally allowable uses. However, we are not proposing to change the major impact thresholds. So I think a lot of these projects would still come before you under that piece.
When you were talking about floor space exemptions for buildings, I think it was 7 or 8 stories for certain mass timber and passive house standards, are there any other conditions or exceptions or things like that based on those type of interests? Or
Yeah, well, specifically related to that one, if you're familiar with the form code, it also includes LEED, I think gold and platinum and a few other standards. So those also apply. This was an older presentation slide. There's no other, the pervious surface areas and other sort of incentive-based approach to trying to get something more sustainable. But with respect to building height, yeah, it's passive house, mass timber, or LEED gold, platinum, a few others.
Where is this amendment in the amendment process?
To your left, the Planning Commission has been great at really, I think, helping solidify this, and they're, I think, at the tail end. We potentially will have another discussion this Thursday, but definitely on Tuesday.
Yeah, we've gone through the public hearing on we had the public hearing carried over 2 different meetings, and we had some discussion, and we will have our discussion continuing at our next. So it's at the tail end.
I would just really like to know what the website is.
Oh. We, if you go to the Office of City Planning, what is it?
Implementing Plan BTV on the left, I think if you click on that.
And you'll find, yeah.
Or if you just Google South End Innovation
Yeah.
District, Burlington, it should be.
Thank you.
I believe there's one large landholder that owns probably a good percentage of that area. Is that landholder on board?
There's actually a few very large landowners, the city being one of them.
Right.
And then there are a couple, I would actually say 3 individual property owners or groups of property owners that are related who own, I can't say the percentage, but probably 80% of the land. I'm not sure, something like that. But yes, properties that are 6 to 7 acres in size right now. Yeah.
And they're on board with this whole concept?
Yeah, we started this process with almost like bi-weekly, at least monthly meetings with a core group of stakeholders that included the property owners. And we've continued outreach with most of those folks throughout the process. And I would say we've seen almost no pushback to the general notion. There has been some sort of, heavy tinkering, I would say, by some of the stakeholders, understandably. But yeah, I think there's pretty strong support for it.
I have another question. The parcel that is owned by the city, that's in the area of the Barge Canal, right? This is just gossip, but I don't know if it's true or not, but the city is working with the planning commission or somebody, or they were talking about trying to preserve part of that as a green space.
Yeah.
Is that
So there are multiple city-owned properties. There is some city-owned land adjacent to the Barge Canal, and there is some land that potentially the city could take control of. I think the vision is to preserve the land in a way that allows for continued conservation of the property, but also acknowledges, I think, the pollution and the contamination of the property. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's going to be a park in the future, but I think it's one of the options on the table. There's a lot of other city-owned property, including 68 Sears Lane. The former homeless encampment is just under 3 acres. The city owns that land, this property, and I think a couple others that are city-owned.
And just for clarity, the large piece of land that contains the water of the Barge Canal is city-owned land and is not part of this district. It's already in a conservation zoning district and is not anticipated to be changed or developed as part of this work.
But there's another piece that connects to Pine Street, is there not?
There are 2 privately owned parcels between...
I thought city-owned, no.
Not right now.
Nothing
Not that I'm aware of. I think 453 and 501 Pine Street are both privately owned parcels. And I know that there have been some discussions about ways that we could improve access and connectivity to the city-owned land.
That's my concern,
and what the future kind of use of each of those parcels might be. But right now, the city only owns that area outside of the orange box that says Barge Canal there.
And there are not other interests in achieving that same goal, but making that green connectivity.
There may be. Those are not discussions that we're actively engaged in, but yeah.
I just had a question about how much we're considering heat. I think there's a lot of this parcel is a parking lot. We've got a lot of there seems like there's a real opportunity as we sort of go forward to do some really constructive work around heat, which I know lots of other cities are thinking about. The Conservation Board is embarking on a comprehensive forest plan for the city, so that has some impact. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but I do think it's super important for us to think about heat. I think and I haven't heard too much about that, and it seems like there's an opportunity to improve what's going on. We already have heat maps for the city. We know this is a pretty warm part of the city. It's just based on having no other green space. And I don't know in the long run if the comprehensive, probably none of us know this yet, will the comprehensive forest plan lead to ordinance that impacts this? I'm not enough of an experienced with zoning and ordinance to know how this would all work or whether this is the right place to think about it. But I do think that I think it's really important, and I think we're highly likely to have some super, super hot spells, which like Pacific Northwest had. And so those things are going to be real. And so I think that there's a lot that can be done about that. There's a lot of strategies. There's a lot of technical know-how about cooling that it involves trees and color and all kinds of stuff. And so I'm just encouraging us. I don't have an active suggestion for that, but I think it's really important for all these folks who are with planning for us to sort out what that combination of trees, color, materials.
There definitely is a material discussion that we want to be overlaid on this, and that builds on this fundamental concern of warmth there. It's a hard thing to impose or enforce a kind of materiality, not necessarily based specifically on aesthetics, but also on their return on investment over time. It's wonderful to put those little sort of Dutch, 4-story complexes. We don't get to that level necessarily very often here. So, you know, it's a question that comes up so often, is if we can, you know, is there a degree to which we can start to develop some covenances around what, you know, sort of densities of trees and materiality and reflectivity and you know, so that it's built for, you know, so that there really is a return to the city on this information district, right? I'm a little bit, I'm a little bit wary of that outcome, I think, but it's something that should be, I think, you know, continue to be discussed and thought about to the extent that it can be.
Right. I hate to cut this conversation because it's a great one, and so maybe let's follow up and have that offline. But we should move on and talk about Trinity Campus.
So we have a lot of other agenda items. So for making sure that Zoe and Patty each have an opportunity to share what they prepared, I'm just going to be very brief and let you know that the 2 other major zoning amendments that the Planning Commission is working on right now have to do with Trinity Campus and a project that we're calling the Neighborhood Code. So I think many of you know that we have a specific zoning overlay district that applies to the Trinity campus within the institutional district. So the Planning Commission has actually moved forward a recommended amendment to the City Council for their consideration that would make a number of changes primarily to the dimensional standards for what is allowed on the Trinity campus, changing building height and setbacks in particular, as well as lot coverage to some degree. So essentially, for those of you that are familiar with the campus now, there is a large setback from Colchester Avenue that precludes development within that setback. We say it's about 115 feet from the property line, which is about 150 feet from the center line of Colchester Avenue, where no buildings are permitted today. So this change would allow some buildings within that setback, buildings up to 4 stories in height, and would then allow for taller buildings on the back kind of depth area of the campus. So those are some of the most notable changes forthcoming on the Trinity Amendment, and I'm happy to answer other questions if you have them about that. The last item that is still in the early stages of development is about new opportunities for neighborhood scale housing across the city. So here in Burlington, we're calling this the Neighborhood Code. In some places, you may have heard this referred to as missing middle housing, but we're really talking about ways that we can look for more of the kind of mix of housing types that we have seen historically in almost all of our neighborhoods, to have a home in our neighborhoods in the future as well. We've spent a lot of time in the last few years focusing on the areas of the city that are zoned for the most intense levels of development, really in the multifamily and mixed-use development end of the spectrum. So this is really giving us an opportunity to look at our residential neighborhoods, 80% of which are zoned for the lowest density residential development today. So through this project, we'll be looking at a number of zoning issues. The first being ways that we can re-legalize existing historic neighborhood patterns that enabled some of these missing middle homes to occur naturally as neighborhoods were developing. We'll also be looking to some solutions to common zoning barriers for enabling more of these small and middle housing types in the future. We're also envisioning that this could take the form of a form code light for some of our residential neighborhoods, really giving us the opportunity to create some more context-sensitive zoning tools for these areas, rather than relying on things like density alone to help us regulate these neighborhoods. And then we'll also be looking at the scale of development that's enabled along some of our major thoroughfares where they run through these neighborhoods. So think like North Avenue, for example, that's zoned almost exclusively low-density residential. So that's just a quick preview of that work. Sarah is helping us do some analyses of our existing patterns, and we will be starting to turn that into brainstorming about some potential zoning changes for that. So I'll stop there so that we can move over to Patty and Zoe, but take any quick questions about either of those if you have them.
about the neighborhood code.
Sure.
Is that going to include considering the poor unrelated adults limitation? And how are you all thinking about that? We often deal with a lot of tension in that area, as you can imagine, with the DRB. So I'm just interested in any thoughts you have about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. It originally was not necessarily part of our scope for this project, but I do know, Andy, I don't know if you want to share your perspective about how you want to look at residential zoning standards at all through this project.
Sure. So we haven't really talked about that one in particular, but in general, the way that I think we ought to approach this is historically, there were a lot of zoning codes that have been put in place because it matched the times. And there are some limitations and some restrictions and some, just as an example I often use is the accessory dwelling units. When the city first adopted those, like 20 years ago or whatever it was, 20, 25 years ago, the approach the city took was we didn't want those. And so they really tried to limit how you could do it. Well, things have really evolved, I think, since then, and those are the kinds of units that we look at and say, for the most part, these are great. Why would, we may have limited them, appropriately then, but today, let's take a fresh look at that. So what I've been encouraging, Megan and Charles to do and others to do is to just take a look at everything and just see, what's appropriate for today, what's not, what changes might there be. So, we haven't gone through any, we haven't looked at four unrelated, we haven't looked at anything as a planning commission. I'm not sure what
No, we haven't either, but yeah.
But just the approach that I've encouraged, at least, and I think the planning commission has also encouraged, is just really take a look at everything. Who knows what changes might be proposed from that, but take a look at everything, because our policies and the reasons for doing things have changed, and we have different tools in place now that we didn't have 10, 20, 30 years ago. So I don't know where this will lead to, but I think you start with everything on the table and then just go from there.
All right. Thank you.
Patty Wayman said earlier, I oversee the housing division. I am not familiar with what the housing division is. We used to be code enforcement. We still have an enforcement role, but there's over 10,000 rental units, about 3,300 residential rental properties in the city, and we took on, we worked with zoning for the last 4 years, so since I was in the last year and a half or so. Then it was a conversation with the city council and the ordinance and whatnot. I'm going to ask you to go to the adopted a few sayings. We have the infrastructure. It just makes sense to include short-term rentals in the long-term rental ordinance. We have a registration process in place. We have an inspection process in place. I have a small team in place to inspect, an admin who can help with this. I think what was, for me, like some of you went through this, thank you. So what was a little bit wonky, at least for us, prior to the zoning division joining us down here and becoming one department, what we learned is that the zoning folks were issuing bed and breakfast permits to something that really wasn't maybe a bed and breakfast or traditional, what people think of as a traditional bed and breakfast. And that definition of traditional bed and breakfast has evolved, or the give short-term and long-term have evolved and come full circle. It felt like we were trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Is it housing or is it a zoning district? It's kind of both. change to chapter 18, it squarely fits on our lap, in our laps. And we have been working with a third party to identify the short-term rentals that are in our community, as well as get a handle on which ones, based on the ordinance, can be short-term rentals and which ones cannot by ordinance. A short-term rental. Long-term rentals are anything, so short-term rentals, anything under 30 days. Okay. Long-term rentals or LTRs are anything over 30 days, short-term is anything under 30 days, that's the short version. We didn't know until we started working with those compliance and granting folks compliance how many really existed in the city, and we have been working with them. We signed a contract, I think it was July 1st. Short version is the section at the bottom. Granicus reports to have 282 short-term units. According to our registration calculation, we have 171, so we're missing. And one of the conditions for being a short-term rental, if it is not owner occupied, is that you can exchange or register with us a long-term rental that meets the affordability criteria for housing under CEDA. So if you do the math, this isn't lining up 100% right, but there's about 100 missing units. If you look at the graph, and I brought my cheat sheet, there are about 60 that Granicus has as short-term rentals, but they have not been able to actually identify them because of concrete address for them. We're working on that and we're meeting with them, but like I said, I have a small team of people who are actually pounding the sand on the pavement to identify some of these places. They're a little bit easier than we think to identify because we all know the neighborhoods and the units that are out there based on what we see through windows and whatnot. Some of them, as you'll see, are not really in Burlington, like some are directions. Some are Winooski, some are South Burlington, some are South Burlington, like beyond the Parkway. So we're teasing out those pieces. Some of them are still listed as short-term rentals, but they haven't been active for the better part of the year. So we're trying to tease out are we going to watch those? It's a small percentage, but are we going to continue to watch those and see if they become active again, like in the spring months, when there's a more active short-term rental population? So it's very quietish right here, January, February, March. That we're going to see some of the ones in the orange section were last active 3 to 4 months ago, which is also, is it a seasonal rental or somebody who's here for half the year, gone half the year? We're going to be watching those, and then there's 6 hotels in the city of Burlington that pop up because they show up on this report because they advertise through the short-term rental platforms, whether it's VRBO or Airbnb, which is good for them, right? This has really been the crux of my job. So there was an expectation versus reality out of the gate. We started digging into this in July. We got really crazy in August, and it hasn't stopped. We really expected, like our long-term rentals, that more people would attempt to register or register, and that's not been the case. With our long-term rentals, about 90% registered without too much effort year after year. We may see that come into play, or that may take hold next year and the following years. We've had the long-term rental registration in place for 25, 35 years. but we, out of the gate, saw about a 40% compliance, which means we need to work to direct outreach. And that's pretty much been the last 2 months. Have been direct outreaches, answering a lot of questions for people who thought they were in compliance, or just had questions about what's in compliance. We would try to start, they've started applications in our database and then didn't respond to our feedback or didn't respond to something, didn't realize that was the communication whatever.
Is there any analysis as to whether that number reflects the reality? Much more than 10% STR operators can't comply. Because the way that's written, they're not current homeowners. The ordinance basically requires for this to operate, essentially have to have an on-site. Either, it has to be out of your primary, yes, your primary residence. So doesn't that lack of registration, like the fact that the majority.
No, I wouldn't say so because, so it's not that it has to be an owner occupied property. You can have a non-compliant short-term rental. You can be in compliance in a multi-unit and not live on site by offering or having a lease that is linked to board building. The real catch here in this whole thing is that we have one. You, AJ, or also may register, be the host for one. It's not resident, you have one. That's, what's that? We want more, but we don't want more. What we're finding, without getting into specific players, is that there's a small group of folks that have multiple units that are refusing to come into compliance. We haven't really gotten into the weeds of this because folks have an opportunity to do that on their own.
The other thing that I would just briefly add to that is that when the ordinance was adopted, it was adopted with a sort of runway, I would say, to compliance. And so the council acknowledged that there were going to be some number of these short-term rentals that would not have a legal path to compliance, to a permit in the long term, and gave them until a date certain, I think it's May of this coming year, to continue to operate. And at that point, we would no longer be issuing permits. So I think part of the hope was that people would register in the interim, and that would also help give us better information about how many we could expect to be registered in the long term. So I think the uptake on that has just not been what we expected.
I mean, we see all these things someday. Sometimes it's like, that's our job. It's the approval. DRB of these 6 of them. Yeah. Is there some process beyond that, aside from that, that these things get approved by, or are we all going to come through the DRB?
Neither. It's totally sit with that. If it wasn't approved, we stop. Speak and the
So, but we're not going by the criteria you're describing. Right. People have to now indeed use this. So the short-term rental is not in the funding anymore?
So you're no longer the DRB&B.
And there's no question in my mind, after having been through all of this, and Megan probably has a finger on the pulse of it better than I and Scott. There will be tweaks to this ordinance. There will be more. I feel confident that there will be greater heat added at some point, potentially. I think you don't mind things. I'm gonna.
Can people please speak into the microphone? I'm having a very hard time hearing on mine.
Sorry, not used to speaking.
Do you know how many were converted to long-term rentals or performance housing?
Do not have clear data on that right now, but I think I can give you I could look into what we have from the different sites or software as well as
So I'll just say there are a lot of questions that members of the community have, all of the boards that have been involved in this, the council, and a big part of us being able to answer questions about, how many short-term rentals are on owner-occupied properties, how many of them have a legal path, how many have converted, etc. These are all contingent on Patty's team being able to get cooperation and actually get those permit records so that we can answer those questions. So.
Like a good portion of what we do as long-term rentals, it's complaint-based. I mean, we don't, outside of the Granicus and what is in the database, register, we don't know to look for, kind of do because we have the database. I'm not saying that that would go, but I would say that a lot of what we've done in the past will give us opportunity to maybe where the neighbors being real compliance. Getting back to what I put together with respect to the PowerPoint, I really expected that there would be more like neighborhood support for what we were doing, and it has not proven to be that supportive. It's been super, a lot of people are really not happy that we haven't come down more aggressively from an enforcement standpoint. We need to know what we're enforcing and who we're enforcing against before we can enforce, and that's not usually our method of getting compliance. It's usually, here's what the rule is, please do this, and then we stick to like zoning, we issue the warning letter, and then you can stop with a violation. We'll ask nicely, we'll educate, and then we'll start with a housing order. We have which can turn into we call it the inspection fee, but it's another one if they haven't done what they're supposed to, and it goes up incrementally. We also have municipal tickets available to us, but we don't feel like we're at that point. We don't have enough of what we are in a few cases, but not in the vast majority. Current activities, literally just wrapped up as I finished writing this today. I think we've identified all but a couple of the 60 unidentified properties. The ones that I mentioned gave us clues but no addresses. The application review is not an instantaneous. I mean, somebody puts information in, it lands in my lap, but at the same time, there's other applications that are coming through. So, and it's never just one touch. It's always multiple touches of, communications with the property owners or the hosts. We are continuing to answer questions from hosts or owners about the ordinance regarding, a lot of people who did come in the last few years to get zoning permits believe that they were covered. And it's not that they're not in good standing, it's that they also need to register as a short-term rental. The other piece that I alluded to earlier and mentioned was that there's been a little growing pains with what Granicus gives us, or understanding what Granicus gives us, where they're getting it from, and making sure that we're speaking the same language. We started getting more consistent data, what they called complete data in September, which was only, 4 months ago. That sounds like a lot, but it's not when we take into account all the other things that are going on. Next steps, pretty simple. We're going to continue teasing out non-compliant hosts and owners and issuing those tickets. Like I said, we started where there's been a reason to start writing these orders, where we feel like we've done our due diligence in warning folks or talking to folks. At some point, we are not talking before, just going to start the orders and reports. We also will need to chat with the city attorney's office at some point here to ensure that we have what we need for that. And then we'll be reporting back to the mayor and the city council about what's working and what's not. The goal for that is end of February, beginning of March.
Okay.
Any questions?
Questions? If not, so I did get your slide.
Yeah.
Wait, I need Megan or Charles to jump here.
And you can just move them for me. I'm happy to just say, next slide, when you get them up. Well, maybe while Scott is getting the slides up, I will just let you know that my goal here is to tell you just a little bit about what the Conservation Board's been up to for like the last 18 months. And I think it's sort of an exciting possibility for the city is investing in nature-based climate solutions. So I know the Planning Commission has seen the plan and read a little bit about some of this work, but not everybody has. So I thought I would just give like a little bit of a brief introduction about nature-based climate solutions. This is some work that we had done for us by a local artist when we went through a planning process. And it just sort of runs through a little bit about what nature-based climate solutions are. And you can just go to the next slide, Scott. Thanks. The city of Burlington has done an incredible job in investing in climate action work. But it has been really, I think, mostly focused on this one central problem that is not an inclusive problem, which is how do you prevent the carbon that's in the ground in the form of fossil fuels from getting into the air as carbon. One of the things that nature-based climate solutions really looks at is how do you all the other ways that we can take carbon out of the air and that we can keep carbon sequestered. And carbon eventually is really cycled through a natural system. So we can't have processes that sort of exclude the natural systems. You can go on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so the classic example of nature-based climate solutions are trees, for example. So trees do this incredible work in which they pull carbon out of the air and they store it right in their bodies. So that's one great thing that trees do. But the other things that they also do is they provide all these ecosystem services. Shade, so cooling, they're really important in terms of cooling cities. And they also cool cities by transpiration. So if you have trees all, in your neighborhood, you get the active cooling through them releasing water out into the world. So we're really thinking a lot about. I was just seeing if someone couldn't hear me. And can the people at home hear? I assume they can now. Great. Yeah. So let's move on to the next slide. So based on this kind of basic information, what the Conservation Board decided to do was put together a plan that sort of said, how do we start having nature-based climate solutions in Burlington? What would that mean? What does that look like? And you can actually go to the next slide. And so those nature-based climate solutions focused on sort of 6 main areas. And I was going to say one thing, but it slipped out of my mind. I can get it back. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. So, the way that we think a lot about carbon and the way that we think about climate action is sort of, I think, well identified in this graph. A lot of times when we're talking about climate action, we're looking at that sort of grayed out space that's talking about how do we prevent fossil fuel and carbon from going into the air, but we sort of neglect the whole natural ecosystem that we really need in order to have a healthy and resilient city. You can go to the next slide. And the reason, so if you focus on like our net zero energy goals and plans, those things are incredible in terms of the contribution that they do for the planet. But when you think about the city itself, like, are those plans for resilience in the city? I think those are really questions that are worth asking. They don't really address things like heat that we know is coming for us. Burlington is, I think, right now the 7th fastest heating city in the country. So it doesn't mean we're going to be as hot as some cities that are in the South, but we really have significant heat issues. Oh, somebody says the first up there. It's somewhere. Yeah. So, I mean, it's Vermont is one of the fastest heating states were like, I think about 4 degrees on average. Burlington's something like 3.9 degrees. This is just a heat map right here that shows, who's going to be most affected by heat as the planet, as the city starts to heat up, and it's the dense urban core. So, nature-based climate solutions are a real opportunity for us to figure out to avoid, through cooling, to avoid putting carbon into the air, but also to make the city much more livable. And I really do think, somebody once said to me something that, you can think of last summer as the hottest summer you ever saw, or you can think of it as the coolest summer you're going to have for the next 20 years. And I think that's really worth us reflecting. And so we really have to plan for our city to be resilient. And nature-based climate solutions, I think, are very high impact and low cost. So a third of climate action, according to the UN, should be nature-based climate solutions. And the White House just came out with a goal that we should have 20% of all of our climate action should be nature-based climate solutions. And this is the document that they just put out ahead of the COP27 summit this fall. Next slide. Yeah, and so, there's if you're a numbers person, there are real numbers behind a lot of these nature-based climate solutions. So, if you look at our existing tree canopy, which is about 42%, it has big carbon storage capacity right now. And if we move to 50% tree canopy, and I'm not saying that's what we should do, but that was something that was outlined in our climate action plan in 2008. You're talking about increased value, also greatly increased capacity to sequester carbon, remove air pollution, we avoid stormwater runoff. It is, when I say that nature-based climate solutions are high impact and low cost, a strategy like let your trees grow bigger, that's a nature-based climate solution. And that's a really low-cost thing to do. So instead of planting a lot of new trees, you can just make sure that some of your other trees get large. So there's a lot of really interesting strategy that is very high impact in terms of what you can store in terms of the capacity to cool your city. Next slide.
Can I ask on that slide, what's
Yeah.
the basis for those numbers? What do those numbers mean? Are those annual savings? Is that the ecosystem services value?
It's the ecosystem services value. Those numbers were generated. We actually worked last year with a graduate student from University of Colorado who generated some of those numbers. They're from pretty common and used by cities programs. I think the carbon storage is from iTree, which I think was generated by the Forest Service and a couple other, but they're like really standard ecosystem service calculators. And they were all reviewed by a number of folks at the University of Colorado who were sort of on the cutting edge of some of that. But I know in terms of air pollution removal, I think the value is calculated based on avoided health incidents. So, and that stuff's pretty significant. So exactly how you get from the stormwater that you've avoided to the cost, I'm not exactly sure what that is, but it's a pretty standard metric. But anyways, there is real value to the city, and in terms of having not only trees, but not only street trees, which are really important in terms of shade, but having healthy forests and regenerating forests. So urban forests are almost as important as street trees in terms of urban cooling. So both are really important. You need to have both. Next one. Yeah, and so in terms of resilience, we know that not only is it hotter, and we are going to have one of these big heat dome events if it's not next year or in 5 years or 6 years, and we also get a tremendous amount of water. A lot of the city, we have open space in the city because we have a floodplain. This is a path in the floodplain. If you go to the next slide, this is the exact same path in an October storm. When was that Halloween storm where Riverside slid? So we expect, this is in the floodplain, but we're getting these pretty dramatic incidences. And so the value of having healthy ecosystems and really focusing on nature-based climate solutions is to make sure that we have things like, appropriate forests to sop stuff up with, a lot of our excess rainwater. And I guess the thing that I would add to that is one of the reasons to think through how to have these healthy, consistent, resilient forests is because climate change also threatens them. So if, we have pollinators that are in decline, if we can no longer pollinate trees, we can't even grow our urban forests anymore. We have extensive invasive species issues. And so we really need to keep we have to pay attention. We have to keep our ecosystems within the city healthy. And so this nature-based climate solutions plan sort of outlines steps to make sure that continues to happen. And it's got an implementation matrix along with it. And now I get to show you sort of a few of the fun things. Other than Lena and Miles, can anyone tell me, does anyone know where this is? I have a prize for you if you can guess. What'd you say?
Wow.
Does anyone know where this is?
Is it a good prize?
You'll have to find out.
For those of you that are online, you could participate too if you know where this is.
Anybody know where this is? This is very close to here. This is the culvert that runs underneath Pine Street, right at Champlain Elementary School, that Englesby Brook, the impaired Englesby Brook, runs down into Oak Ledge and into Lake Champlain. And it's incredible. It's full of the old, red stone construction. And you can move to the next slide, Scott. These are wildlife cam photos from just above there. So there's gray fox, there's wood duck, there are wood duck babies, and there's green heron in there. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that the good news is we have a lot of functional ecosystems in Burlington. This is one of the densest, most urbanized part of the city with the least amount of green space, and we've got incredible known traffic and corridors moving through there. But there's a lot of threat, and so we really need this plan and this implementation matrix to make sure that we have these areas in perpetuity, and that they provide incredible services. And then I'm just going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that are ongoing in the city that are pretty exciting about implementing nature-based climate solutions. So here's one of them that's gotten some attention. It's a collaborative project with the school district and the Parks Department and a couple of other partners, where we are actively growing a tree nursery at Champlain Elementary School. So we started out by planting a wildlife corridor because Parks Department had some extra trees that needed to get moved from the property they owned near Cambrian Rise. And so they asked the school if they could connect Englesby Brook to a little piece of patch of forest. And so all the kids were involved in planting all these native trees and shrubs. And then they decided to go ahead and start a tree nursery right on the school grounds. And if you go to the next slide, Scott. So they've been working with the Intervale Center to both collect cuttings and seeds from local parks and to plant them right on site. And all kids have been participating, and it's been an incredible program. On the left, that's a stick nursery. Kids took cuttings from all over a bunch of local parks, and they have something like 500 trees that they planted in these cuttings forms, and they have done incredibly well. If you go to the next slide, that's the stick garden now. I think on the right, there's something like 350 willow stems, and then there's like 300 high bush cranberry, and I can't remember what the other's dogwood to the left of that. So those are all now available for restoration projects around the city. And if you think about the fact that instead of ordering trees from the Midwest that are put in pots full of fertilizer that get shipped to Vermont, you have kids who are now growing, who are fanning out to local parks, who are growing trees on school ground sites. They understand the value of native species. They understand why they're doing it. They feel a lot of agency in climate change. It's place-based education. It's nature connection. Those willow trees we're going to plant out. So these were planted this is early in the fall. These were planted last spring, and they're going to go into an Englesby Brook restoration project right there on site. And So anyways, it's just been an incredible process for the kids. The Parks Department has been really supportive. One of the things that the Conservation Board is considering is, and working with council and the Parks Commission is, can we use some of the legacy fund money to support projects that are similar to this, that support nature-based climate action, that allow, inclusive participation in climate action that's really doable in the city and makes a big difference. So you could go to the next slide. And that's not the only project. There's like a great example project out on Manhattan Drive where DPW cleared out this whole section off the side. It's kind of it's right above the Manhattan landfill. And it's had all these native plants put in there, an orchard. Neighbors have been working on it. Parks Department, these are high school kids planting all kinds of native shrubs. They've been, and so, students get a little bit of hands-on work. They have an understanding of why the value of planting more trees, of nature-based climate action, and they have a lot of connection with their locals, with local areas in the city, and they spend time outside. So, and what's up next for us? The Conservation Board is working on an urban forest comprehensive plan. The Parks Department was going to do just a forest plan for the parks, but it seems really important that we think about the city as a whole when we think about our climate action, and we think about how much canopy we want to have in the city, how we make sure that our urban forests stay healthy. And so we are embarking with a bunch of partners on a plan for the whole city, and that may lead to some ordinance change based on what we discover through that. And we think that both the nature-based climate solutions plan that we've already written and the urban forest comprehensive plan, I hope, will be the basis of sort of a next generation open space protection plan. Our open space protection plan is almost 25 years old now, and I know it's due to be rewritten in the next few years. So it'll really have climate change in mind. And that's it.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the end of tonight's agenda. Do you have questions for Zoe, or do you want to?
Or do you have things that we didn't talk about that you want to know about with the remaining time?
I see that there's so many interesting opportunities to take something like, everything you're doing, connecting it to building a new, district and neighborhood, incentives for that
Right.
type of thing, rather than just saying, you can, platinum because you added bike racks, what
Right.
does that really do for the city versus if you can hit 60% tree coverage or not cut down certain trees on this land and let them grow really big, you can have this other thing right now.
Yeah, and I think the goal of the reason that I think we're trying to set these plans is so that we can start to do some of that. And I don't want folks to think, I recognize that the city is a place that we should be developing. And so these aren't anti-development goals. What they really are is, how do you have a smart, effective city with a healthy ecosystem? And, there are lots of ways in which our ecosystems are struggling right now. And so there are things like we probably should have a native species ordinance. We know that we have insect decline and bird decline because we don't plant natives, and insects need the native species, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work that we can do, and we can build an incentive structure there. But we felt like we needed some of these plans in place before we could get there, so that it sort of builds the science behind sort of getting to a more of an ordinance structure for some of this work. And I think it's really exciting. And I think the bar is fairly low to doing some of this stuff. The cost is fairly low, and the impact is really, really high. But we can't forget about it. We can't think that we can solve our climate problems without, dealing with the fact that we have to have ecosystem health. We have deer in the city that are preventing regeneration of forests. There are credible foresters at UVM who think that Chittenden County could move towards an unforested state in the near future because there's so many threats. We can't regenerate trees because we don't have pollinators. We can't regenerate them because we have deer eating them down. We have invasive species, so they're not making them, they never they never can get out of the, into the canopy. So these are the kind of real threats that we're thinking about and thinking about how do we mitigate them. And they're important. It'll be one hot city where your crops will not grow if we don't really consider this kind of stuff.
Thank you, Zoe. That was great.
So normally this is where we would hear about the need to have updated short-term rental regulations, but since we've taken that off your plate, I don't know if there's anything else that anybody wanted to bring up. It's fine if not. If you're ready to leave, that's totally fine.
I guess I'm gonna say it just because it's we experience it. For some of us, the fact that the ordinance had nothing to offer us relative to the cathedral in terms of historic status was quite disappointing. To me, that's a gap in our ordinance. Should provide the catch-all that federal standards have. Yeah, I would not adopt the ordinance, I understand.
Wait, can you?
Yeah,
So
so
explain into the microphone, maybe.
Yeah, definitely make sure to talk in the mic.
So we recently approved the demolition of the cathedral located at 20 Pine Street. Leaving aside what the religious status of the church did to the zoning standards the DRB can apply, zoning regulations state that for historic properties, they have to be either registered in the National Registry or eligible for registration. That includes meeting 3 sub-criteria using the term N. One of the N requirements was 50 years old. Federal standards provide a catch-all provision or a similar broader net that allows properties that are less than 50 years old but have clear architectural or historic significance to be eligible for listing. I think it behooves us to think about the benefit of including that catch-all provision, because there are clearly properties that obtain historic significance either by architectural or historic events that are not 50 years old. And given the fact the RP is what I'll classify as probably too many debates over the historic use or demolition or rehabilitation of things that are relatively unattractive, like sheds behind people's homes. I think it was frustrating to not have that ability to consider it.
Understood. Thank you. Yeah, I know we've had conversations too with Scott and Mary. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that, but certainly a historic preservation plan is something that is on our radar for the very near term. And in my view, and in the discussions that we've had, one of the important elements of that is for us to use that opportunity to identify the things in our community that really are important, that we really feel we need tools and opportunities to conserve and allow to evolve, and maybe to identify the things that are not serving us as well in terms of our ordinance structures and other tools. So I think what I hear you saying is that this kind of fits right into that discussion. I think this comes up a lot too when we talk about, renovations of properties, materials, things like that, that you all have dealt with a lot as well. So that's certainly something that is a high priority on our radar to begin soon. And I would envision that then informing ordinance changes as well.
I think there's a real opportunity to take a look at benefits to kind of destigmatizing historic designation and try to connect any incentive of that designation to addressing missing middle housing, short-term rentals, small-scale housing initiatives to try to increase the amount of units available in Burlington. There's plenty of units, the most affordable units we have are the ones we already have, are just in extreme disrepair. And I think there's a really interesting kind of low hanging fruit option. That should be explored.
All right. Thanks, Brad. Any other topics? All right. Great. Thank you all for the time. Thanks for those of you that joined online. Sorry for the audio issues, but thanks for sticking with us and participating.
I know.
Hey, listen, if you want to come
Hey,
plant trees,
come
we can
on
find some
over.
trees for you to plant.
Yeah. Yeah. You know.
And then all of a sudden it's done. Okay.
Forest slide, high quantity.
Low is inclusive. Communities who have kids for food. Here. My ride's about to get here, but I have a whole site I built a position that is new in the project. Education and
Now, are you working?
Yes.
Oh, in planning. Oh, that's so exciting because I feel like I don't know that much about it, and I'm like,
would love to, hearing you talk about it.
Yeah.
I really love the general practice of